She changed the locks on my own daughter's house the same week I buried my wife. I found out on a Tuesday morning, standing on the front porch of the Colonial in Ridgewood, with a casserole dish in one hand and a bag of Sophie's favorite gummy bears in the other, and my key just wouldn't turn. I tried it twice. Then the door opened from the inside, and my son-in-law, Craig, stood there in a polo shirt and khakis, like he was greeting a real estate client, and he said, "We've updated security, Frank. New system. You'll need to call ahead from now on." He didn't take the casserole. He didn't mention the gummy bears. He smiled the way people smile when they've rehearsed something and they're pleased with how it landed. My daughter, Laura, was somewhere behind him. I could hear Sophie's little voice down the hallway asking who was at the door. She was 4. She called me Papa Frankie because when she was 2, she couldn't say Grandpa, and I never corrected her, because it was the best thing anyone had ever called me. My name is Frank Moretti. I'm 58 years old. I spent 26 years as a fire inspector for Bergen County, New Jersey, walking through buildings and checking the things nobody wants to think about until they fail. Exit routes, sprinkler systems, load capacities. My whole career was built on one idea. If you look carefully enough, you can see where the danger is before anyone gets hurt. I retired 3 years ago, about 6 months after my wife, Helen, was diagnosed with ALS. 14 months from the first tremor in her left hand to the morning she stopped breathing in the hospital bed we'd set up in our living room in Fair Lawn. She was 54. We'd been married 31 years, and in all that time, I never once heard her raise her voice at anyone. Not at me, not at Laura, not at the woman who rear-ended her at the ShopRite parking lot in 2014 and then tried to blame her for it. Helen had this way of staying quiet that wasn't passive. It was deliberate, like she was choosing not to waste words on things that didn't deserve them. She saved her energy for the things that did, birthday cards that went on for 3 pages, phone calls with Laura that lasted an hour, the way she would sit on the floor with Sophie and build these elaborate block towers and then let Sophie knock them down and pretend to be devastated every single time. After Helen died, I expected grief. I was ready for grief. I had read the books while she was sick. I had talked to the hospice counselor. I knew about the waves, the triggers, the way an empty chair can ruin a Tuesday afternoon. What I was not ready for was the disappearing. Not mine, my daughter's. Or more precisely, my access to my daughter. It happened in stages, so gradual that I kept explaining each step away like a man smelling smoke and telling himself it's probably just the neighbor's grill. The locks were first. Then Craig mentioned that Sophie's pediatrician had recommended a more structured schedule, which meant my drop-in visits on Wednesday afternoons needed to become planned visits, scheduled in advance, preferably by text, so there was a record. I thought that was strange language, a record, but I didn't push. I was tired and sad, and I didn't want to make things harder for Laura, who I assumed was dealing with her own grief in her own way. I texted. I scheduled. I showed up when I was told to. Craig would meet me at the door, every time. Laura was always busy. Upstairs with a headache, on a work call, napping because Sophie had kept her up. I saw my daughter maybe 10 minutes per visit, and even then, Craig was always nearby, leaning in the doorway or sitting in the next room with the door open. I should tell you about Craig because you need to understand the kind of person we're talking about. Craig Devlin, 39, commercial real estate broker, originally from outside Philadelphia. He and Laura met at a friend's wedding in Hoboken 6 years ago. He was charming in a way that I recognized, but couldn't quite name at the time. He asked good questions. He remembered details. He had this habit of making you feel like whatever you just said was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. Helen liked him at first. Most people did. But about 2 years into the marriage, Helen told me one night while we were doing dishes that something about Craig reminded her of a house she'd once asked me to inspect for a friend. "What do you mean?" I asked. She said, "The outside was beautiful. Fresh paint, new shutters. But you told them the foundation had cracks they couldn't see from the street." That was Helen. She never accused anyone of anything. She just described what she noticed and let you do the math. I should also tell you about the money. When Laura and Craig got married, Helen and I gave them a wedding gift of $35,000. It was most of what we had in savings beyond our retirement accounts. We wanted them to have a strong start. Laura had student loans. Craig was building his brokerage. We wrote a check, gave it to them at the reception dinner, and Helen hugged Laura for a long time and said, build something good. We didn't ask where it went. We didn't set conditions. It was a gift from parents who loved their daughter and believed in the life she was building. After Helen's death, the visits got shorter. Then they got less frequent. Then they came with conditions. Craig sent me an email, not a phone call, not a conversation, an email, explaining that he and Laura had been discussing my role in Sophie's life and felt it would be beneficial to establish some guidelines. He called them household expectations. The email had 7 bullet points. Visits limited to Saturday afternoons, 1 to 3 p.m. No unscheduled phone calls to Laura's personal cell. All gifts for Sophie must be approved in advance. No food items without checking with Laura regarding allergies and dietary preferences. No solo outings with Sophie. No discussing household finances or Laura's career decisions. And at the bottom, a line that read, "We appreciate your cooperation in making this work for everyone." I read that email 4 times. I remember the way the light was coming through the kitchen window, hitting the counter right where Helen used to set her coffee mug in the morning. I remember thinking that I should be angry, but the feeling that came was something else. It was the feeling I used to get in an inspection when I'd open a utility closet and find wiring that someone had jury-rigged to avoid code. Not anger, recognition. I had seen this before. Not the specifics, but the pattern. I didn't respond to the email that night. I called Laura the next morning. She answered on the 5th ring, and her voice sounded thin, like she was talking from the far end of a long hallway. "Dad, I can't really talk right now." I asked her if she was okay. "I'm fine. Craig and I just think some structure would be good for Sophie." I asked her if the email was from both of them. She paused. We discussed it together. I said okay. I said I loved her. She said she loved me too, quickly, like she was checking a box, and hung up. I sat there for a while after that call. I thought about the word structure, and how it sounded like something you build to protect people, but could also be something you build to contain them. I followed the rules. Every Saturday, I drove 35 minutes from Fair Lawn to Ridgewood and parked on the street, never in the driveway, because Craig had mentioned once that his clients sometimes came to the house, and he needed the space. I rang the doorbell at 1 p.m. Craig let me in. I sat in the living room with Sophie, who would climb into my lap and tell me about her week in that breathless, tangential way that 4-year-olds talk, where a story about a caterpillar at preschool turns into a question about whether birds have eyelids, which becomes a very serious discussion about whether Papa Frankie has ever touched a cloud. I answered every question. I stayed until 3 p.m. I said goodbye to Sophie, waved to Laura if she was visible, and drove home. This went on for 3 months. Then Craig added a new condition. He called me on a Wednesday evening, very professional, very measured, and said that he and Laura had been reviewing their financial picture and that they felt it was appropriate for me to contribute to Sophie's childcare and enrichment costs as a condition of continued regular visits. He used the phrase access arrangement. He said $850 a month, transferred to an account he would set up. He said it wasn't about the money, it was about shared responsibility and demonstrating commitment. He said it the way you say something you've practiced in front of a mirror. I asked to speak to Laura. He said she was putting Sophie to bed. I asked him to have her call me. She didn't call that night. She didn't call the next day. On Friday, I got a text from Laura's number that read, "Dad, Craig explained the arrangement to you. I think it's fair. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." I read that text and I knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life looking at structures, that those were not my daughter's words. I did not sleep well that week. I sat in the chair by the window where Helen used to read, and I looked at the framed photo on the side table, the one from the day Sophie was born, Helen, in the hospital, holding this tiny, red-faced creature, and looking at the camera with an expression of such complete, uncomplicated joy that it almost hurts to see it now. I talked to Helen that night. Not in a mystical way, just in the way you talk to someone who isn't there anymore, but whose opinion you still trust more than anyone else's. I said, "I think our daughter is in trouble, and I don't know how to help her without making it worse." Helen didn't answer, obviously, but I could hear what she would have said. She would have said, "Look at the foundation, Frank." The next morning, I called my neighbor, Jim Hargrove, who had gone through a custody battle with his ex-wife 2 years earlier. I asked him for the name of his attorney. He gave me the number for a woman named Andrea Rice, a family law attorney in Hackensack who Jim described as the kind of person who talks quietly and carries a very thick file. I called her office and got an appointment for the following Tuesday. Andrea Rice was about 50, gray-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had a way of listening that reminded me of the structural engineers I used to work with. She didn't interrupt. She took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished telling her everything, she set her pen down and said, "Mr. Moretti, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe your daughter is being financially controlled by her husband?" I said yes. She nodded like I had confirmed something she already suspected. Then she said, "Here's what I need you to do. I need you to gather every piece of communication you have. Emails, texts, anything in writing. I need you to document every visit, every cancellation, every condition that's been imposed. Dates, times, what was said. And I need you to talk to whoever handled your finances about that $35,000 gift." I asked why the gift mattered. She said, "Because when money is given freely and then used as leverage, the nature of that gift becomes very relevant. And because I want to understand the full financial picture of that household before we take any steps." My accountant was a man named Victor Espinoza, who had been doing my taxes since I was still at the county. Victor was meticulous in the way that accountants should be, and often aren't. He kept digital copies of everything. When I called him and explained what I needed, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Frank, let me pull some things together. Come in Thursday." I went in Thursday. Victor had the records laid out on his desk. The check for $35,000, the deposit date, the bank it went into, a joint account in Laura and Craig's names, and then the trail after that. Within the first 6 months, approximately $26,000 had been transferred out of the joint account and into a brokerage account in Craig's name alone. Not the brokerage he ran for clients, a personal investment account that, based on the records Victor had been able to cross-reference through documents Laura had once shared with me during a period when she'd asked for help with her taxes, had been quietly accumulating funds. The remaining $9,000 had gone toward credit card payments on accounts also in Craig's sole name. None of it had gone toward the house, the wedding debt, or Laura's student loans. I sat in Victor's office, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not rage, something colder and more useful. The feeling you get when you've been smelling smoke for months, and you finally find the source, and it's exactly where you thought it was. I didn't say a word to anyone. Not to Laura, not to Craig, not to Jim next door, who kept asking if I was all right. For 6 weeks, I continued the Saturday visits. I followed every rule. I rang the bell at 1. I sat with Sophie. I told her about the cardinals that had built a nest in the maple tree in my backyard, and she decided that the cardinals' names were Ketchup and Mustard, and I promised her I would tell Ketchup and Mustard that they'd been named. Craig hovered. Laura stayed upstairs or in the kitchen. I smiled and left at 3 and drove home and added notes to the file that Andrea Rice was building. During one of those visits, Sophie was sitting on my lap drawing a picture of what she said was a horse but looked more like a friendly cloud with legs, and she looked up at me and said, "Papa Frankie, how come you don't stay for dinner anymore?" I said, "Your mom and dad have a busy schedule, sweetheart." She thought about that for a second, the way kids do when they're testing an answer against their own experience, and then she said, "Mom cries sometimes after you leave." I didn't say anything to that. I held her a little tighter and told her the horse was beautiful, because it was. In the 7th week, Andrea Rice called me and said, "We're ready." She had prepared 2 documents. The first was a formal letter addressed to Craig, outlining the $35,000 gift and the documented movement of funds, requesting a full accounting and the return of misappropriated money. The letter noted that the funds, given for the purpose of building a household together, had instead been diverted to personal accounts without the knowledge or consent of either the donor or his co-recipient. The second document was a petition to the Bergen County Family Court for grandparent visitation rights under New Jersey statute, citing a pattern of unreasonable restriction of access and documented evidence of familial isolation. Andrea had also prepared a third document, one I hadn't asked for but she felt was necessary. It was a summary addressed to Laura directly, written not in legal language but in plain English, explaining what the financial records showed and offering the contact information for a domestic financial abuse counseling service. Andrea said, "Your daughter may not know the full picture, If she does, this will feel redundant. If she doesn't, it could change everything. I put all 3 documents in a manila envelope. I drove to Ridgewood on a Saturday. It was October, and the trees along the street were doing that thing they do in northern New Jersey in the fall, burning orange and gold like the whole neighborhood is quietly on fire. I parked on the street. I walked up the path. Craig opened the door. He did the smile. I could hear Sophie somewhere inside singing a song I didn't recognize. I said I had something for Laura. Craig started to say something about how now wasn't a good time, that Laura was resting. I said, "Craig, this will take 2 minutes. I'd like to give this to Laura directly." Something in my voice or my face must have been different that day because he paused. Then he stepped aside. Laura was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of tea. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a bad night's sleep, but the deep, permanent tired that settles in when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you've forgotten what it feels like to put it down. She saw me and her face did something complicated. Surprise and worry and something underneath that looked like relief. "Dad? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said. "I have something for you." I handed her the envelope. She opened it. She read the first page, the letter to Craig. Her hands were steady. She read the second page. Her hands were not steady anymore. She read the third document, the one Andrea had written for her specifically, and she sat down on the kitchen stool very slowly, the way you sit down when your legs have made a decision your brain hasn't caught up to yet. Craig had followed me into the kitchen. He saw the papers. "What is this?" Laura looked up at him. I will never forget her face in that moment. It was the face of someone who has just been handed the name for something they've been feeling for years. "Did you move the money?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Laura, that's not what $26,000, Craig. Into your personal account. Dad gave us that money. He gave it to both of us." Craig looked at me. I looked back at him with the calmest expression I have ever worn in my life. He started to talk about investments and long-term planning and how I didn't understand the full picture. Laura put the papers down on the counter. "I want you to leave the kitchen," she said. "Right now." He left. Not the house, just the kitchen. But it was enough. It was the first boundary Laura had set in that house in a very long time, and we both knew it. We sat at that kitchen counter for an hour. Sophie came in at one point and climbed into Laura's lap and said, "Papa Frankie, are you staying for dinner?" Laura looked at me over Sophie's head and her eyes were wet, and she said, "Yeah, sweetheart, Papa Frankie's staying for dinner." We ordered pizza. Sophie ate 3 slices, which she announced was a personal record. I told her I was proud of her. Laura laughed for the first time in what felt like a year. What happened after that was not fast, and it was not simple. Laura called Andrea Rice the following Monday, not as my lawyer, but as hers. Andrea referred her to a colleague who specialized in divorce and financial recovery. There were months of conversations, some of them loud, some of them legal, some of them just Laura sitting in my kitchen in Fair Lawn drinking coffee and staring out the window, trying to figure out who she was, without the scaffolding that Craig had built around her. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Laura got the house. Craig got his brokerage and the debt attached to it. The $35,000 was addressed in the settlement. Not all of it came back. About $8,000 had been spent in ways that couldn't be recovered. Andrea told me it wasn't worth the fight. I agreed. Some money is just the price of finding out who people really are. Laura is different now. Not the daughter I had before Craig. Not the quiet, careful woman she became during the marriage. Something new, something that has her mother's eyes and her own voice, which is stronger than she knows. She went back to work as a graphic designer. She's freelancing from the house in Ridgewood, and the front door is unlocked most days, and I come by whenever I want, and nobody asks me to sign anything. Sophie is 5 now. She lost her first tooth last month, a bottom one, and she called me on Laura's phone before the tooth fairy had even been notified. "Papa Frankie," she said, breathing hard like she'd been running, "I can fit a blueberry through the hole." I drove over. I took a picture of her grinning with a blueberry wedged in the gap, which she insisted on, and I printed it and put it on the refrigerator next to the photo of Helen holding her in the hospital. Helen would have lost her mind over that tooth. She would have written a card. She would have called every relative we have. She would have baked something and brought it over and sat on the floor with Sophie and probably cried a little, because Helen cried at everything good. I want to say something to you if you're watching this, and something in this story sounds familiar. if someone in your family is being managed, if visits come with conditions, if love has been turned into a transaction, if you're a parent or a grandparent and you feel like you're being slowly erased from someone's life, one rule at a time, you are not imagining it. It has a name. It's called coercive control, and it doesn't always look like yelling or violence. Sometimes it looks like a polite email with bullet points. Sometimes it looks like your daughter not calling you back. Sometimes it looks like your grandchild asking why you don't stay for dinner anymore. You have options. In most states, grandparents have legal standing to petition for visitation when access is being unreasonably withheld. In New Jersey, the statute specifically considers the prior relationship between the grandparent and child. I didn't know that before I met Andrea. I'm telling you now because maybe you don't either. Document everything. Save every text, every email. Write down dates and what happened. If you gave money to family, find the records. Not because you don't trust them, because paperwork protects everyone. It protects the relationship when things are good, and it protects you when things aren't. And if you see someone being isolated, say something. Not in a way that blows everything up, but say something. Because the person inside that situation often can't see it. They're too busy following the rules. They're too tired to question why the rules exist in the first place. Last weekend, Sophie and I went to the park near my house. She found a feather on the ground, bright red, from a cardinal. She held it up and said, "Papa Frankie, this is from Ketchup." I said it probably was. She put it in her pocket very carefully, like it was something valuable, and then she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the swings. I looked back at Laura, who was sitting on a bench with her coffee, watching us, and she smiled at me, not a careful smile, not a managed smile, a real one. Helen would have loved that afternoon. She would have found the feather first, probably. She would have made up a whole story about ketchup and mustard and their adventures, and Sophie would have believed every word, and so would I. I like to think she was there, sitting on the bench next to Laura, drinking her coffee, watching her granddaughter run through the leaves with a cardinal feather in her pocket and a blueberry-sized gap in her smile.